Hi, everyone. Doc T here with another episode of the Horses Advocate podcast. Thank you for joining me. I heard a word today that just resonated with me, and it was called preconception or a preconceived idea. And we seem to have our strength in our beliefs. So I've talked about this a lot in podcasts and in blogs called cognitive dissonance, which could also be called siloing. So we believe what we know. We don't like what we don't like, and we love what we love. And there's very little gray areas anymore. We're all tuned into this technology where we can voice our own opinions. So nothing egregious actually happened. I've got people who disagree with me, and yet in their comments actually agree, but they look at it a little bit differently. I have more fans, people who agree with me, people who have tried what I've tried and have had success, but never, tell me about it. Those who are vocal, though, are pretty vocal. And I have to include myself in that because I have my cognitive dissonance. I believe what I believe, and that is we're here to help the horses thrive in a human world. And the human world has changed in the past 40 to 50 years. When I started working with horses in 1973, there were a lot of things that were different. And the biggest change that has occurred is back then we had oats, we had some wheat bran, we had soybean meal, and we had pasture, and we had hay. And most of the hay was dusty. It was hard to get really good hay. But now we have hay that's almost mold-free, dust-free, because it's being dried, usually using some desiccant. One of the common ones is glyphosate, also known as Roundup. We have genetic modification of alfalfa, of oats, of all the grains that are going into the horse, and of course, soybean meal. We have the use of less land because it's too expensive. A lot of our horses are performance horses and are not allowed to have access to pasture. Back in the day, in, let's say, United Kingdom, horses were kept in their pasture and would be allowed to run around, and then they would be ridden to the racetrack. I remember way back in the 70s, no, it was the 80s, pardon me, it was in the 80s, I had one fella in upstate New York who would take his horse by trailer down to Aqueduct or Belmont racetrack and race, and the horse would win. He would just absolutely clean up. He'd put the horse back on the trailer and drive it back to his farm and turn it out for a week on his pasture where he could run around and be a horse. Nobody does that anymore. They're all kept in stalls 23 hours a day. There are downsides and upsides to that strategy. The upside being that it's easier for us. We can run the horse business as a business and spend less time, running the horse up and down the road and, taking care of it at home, I guess. I don't know. But we all have our preconceived ideas. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. And back in the 70s, when I started with horses, it was pretty simple taking care of horses. And through the 80s, it started to get complicated. And then the 90s, 2000, here we are, 2024. And I open up magazines and I'm overwhelmed with the supplements and the come-ons, the one line saying your horse has this and we can solve it. And the science behind it is so thin. And that's being generous, I think, in many instances. Some of the science or most of the science is paid for by the company trying to sell you that product. And you've heard me complain about this over and over and over again. So the question is, why am I a 70-plus-year-old veterinarian who still is out floating teeth by hand, sitting behind this microphone, trying to help you, the horse owner, or hopefully you, the horse professional, which includes veterinarians, listen to other possibilities. you are coming out of your silo of your cognitive dissonance and your opinion, and you're wanting to learn something from a different point of view. And it's frustrating because I know in dentistry, I don't think I've had more than 2 veterinarians come to me and say, wow, this is really different. I'd like to learn this. They are set in their ways in what they believe is the truth because their professor at their school, who has a lot less experience than I do, will teach you certain things and back it up with quote unquote science. And as you've heard from me in the past, I just did my 80,000th horse, and I have some strong opinions based on just numbers. But I don't want to go down the dentistry hole with you guys. I want to bring to your attention this magazine called The Horse, which is sent to every veterinarian who's a member of the American Association of Equine Practitioners, and possibly to you as the horse owner. And what's really interesting about this is, do you see on the bottom here? My fingers are there, right there. The many faces of equine metabolic syndrome. And I'm like, wow, I got to read this. This is going to be fascinating because this is a layperson's magazine and it's on page 12. So the first thing I do after putting my glasses on is I start to rummage through the pages from the first page to the last page. And on page 1, not the cover, but page 1, we have Platinum Performance with Trusted Nutrition since 1996, developed by veterinarians to address health at the cellular level. All right. Then I turn the page and then I have Equine, so your horse can stand out. And then I start turning the pages and I'm looking for any other nutrient supplements. And I turn several pages. On page 11, we have lasting partnerships produce enduring friendships, partners with the American Association of Equine Practitioners that make a difference. And the educational partners include Cargill and Platinum Performance and Purina. The rest of them are not nutritional. So then I get to the page 12, the many faces of equine metabolic syndrome. So I just keep turning the pages, and now I have equine medical and surgery, equine medical and surgical products to keep your horses in peak health. And they are talking about their Health E, which is maximum strength vitamin E. So that's going to be interesting. As I look on the whole page, I'm looking to find out if it's natural vitamin E or man-made vitamin E. And I'm not seeing it. So I don't see the ingredients at all. So I feel like they're hiding something. Then I go to Kentucky Performance Products, simple solutions, scientifically proven. Management tips for horses with EMS, equine metabolic syndrome, and PPID, which is pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction, also known as Cushing's disease. And they have their thoughts, but it's a full-page advertisement that looks like an authoritative article. They said dietary adjustments, exercise, and supplements, which includes their products Insulin-Wise, Elevate, and Microphase. So again, I don't see anything on their ingredients list, but it probably costs a lot of money to list it. But they do say visit their website for more information. Okay, cool. So I keep turning the page. I'm passing any advertisements that are not about nutrition. And so far, I'm not seeing any. I keep turning the page. More pages. Hang in there, folks. I'm sure I'm going to find something in here about grain. And I keep looking, And I'm not seeing it. I'm almost to the end of the articles. Then on the very last page, on the back side of the cover, we have another advertisement from Equine Medical and Surgical Associates, where they're advertising something called Comfort Quick for joint health and mobility. Some of the ingredients that are in there: epoxygen, whatever that is, hemp, no corn sugar, and no glucosamine, which may increase insulin resistance. So they're basically saying, here's a joint supplement that will not affect horses with insulin resistance. And finally, the back page, and we have Pet Thrive, which is resveratrol, and it looks like it's made for dogs because it has a picture of a dog. Yeah, it says for dogs 60 pounds or greater, and then they also have EquiThrive Complete Joint. So it doesn't really have any information about what's in it. So there's a whole magazine right here that has 0 advertisements for grain. And how could it? I mean, it's saying the many faces equine metabolic syndrome, which is all basically excess glucose that's been ingested, and it's leading to how the cascade of events, which I've gone over so many times on these podcasts, that if you're listening to this, you might be begging me not to go through it anymore. And I get it. But then again, here it comes. So let's look at unveiling what EMS and ID really look like. Just to remind you, equine metabolic syndrome is EMS, and ID is insulin dysfunction. And insulin dysregulation. And I've argued that calling it insulin dysregulation may not be correct. I believe that insulin is doing its job as designed, and it's doing it really, really well. But it's not responding as well because of the increased amount of carbohydrates that entering the diet of the horse. So they basically start off by talking about what EMS is, and they quote the Equine Endocrinology Group and their guidelines, and they call the ECEIM consensus statement, and that's fine. I'm glad there's a group of people out there talking about this. But one of the first things they go for is obesity. And it says the overconditioned population with regional adiposity at the tailhead, as well as a cresting neck, is truly the face of EMS, especially ponies. Current estimates suggest 22 to 27% of ponies are hyperinsulinemic, meaning they have excess insulin in their blood. So that's great. I mean, we've always known fat ponies are prone to laminitis, which is secondary to insulin resistance or something else that's going on. It seems like every horse that has laminitis is also IR, insulin resistant, or ID, dysregulated. But one of the things in that statement says that the ponies are hyperinsulinemic. So what does that mean? It means that the amount of insulin is high in the blood. Now, why is it high in the blood? It's because you have excess sugar, so the horse is producing more and it's staying around longer. So if you take a meal and you're perfect in every way, healthy-wise, and we measure your insulin after a meal, you're going to have higher insulin and you're going to have high glucose in your blood as everything starts to key up to do their jobs. But in the insulin resistant horse, you're going to find that the insulin is a lot higher and it stays a lot longer as it's struggling to grab onto these glucose molecules and get them out of the bloodstream. Remember, at the root level, glucose should not be in the blood. When you have free-flowing blood glucose that's in excess of what we call normal, that can be doing damage to the arteries and vessels in many, many ways. In humans, it can create a roughened surface to which small particles of lipoproteins that are in the low density lipoprotein, LDL, the small particle size of the fats that are going in there can catch and start to accumulate. And then the mast cells come in, which are specific white blood cells that come in to try and clean up the garbage and haul it out, but they get trapped. So you start to get a foam, and then you start to get a plaque, and then you start to get reduction of blood flow through that vessel. And next thing you know, either you have a stroke or you have a cardiovascular event, and even possibly death. And it's the #1 killer in humans worldwide, cardiovascular disease. So it is really critical to get our glucose in our blood down to manageable levels, because glucose is released all the time from the liver and it goes straight up to the brain and can enter the brain with or without insulin. But when you start to get insulin resistance, insulin has to do something with the glucose. It's either going to put it in your muscle or in your liver, up in the brain. It's going to put it someplace where it can be put to use. But if every place it goes to says, no, I'm full, I've got enough sugar, there's no room for excess sugar here, then fat's going to take it over to the liver, where it's going to convert the glucose molecule into a free fatty acid, and it's going to shove it into a fat cell for future use. That is perfect, because we want excess body fat. So when the ice age comes or the long winter approaches, we have the body fat that we can get into and use. It saves our lives. Body fat is good to a point. It's when you overstuff the fat cell with fat molecules, then the fat cell, which is an endocrine organ, will start to release all sorts of factors that are going to cause inflammation. The analogy I give you is, if you and I are standing in your stall talking to each other, and we decide to bring our friends in, and their friends, and more friends. And so in your small stall, which is very comfortable with you and me standing there, we now have 40, 50, 60 people in there. We're actually touching each other with our bodies. We're speaking into each other's faces with, spit coming out because we're so close. That feeling of uncomfortableness is what the fat cell goes through, and it releases these molecules called cytokines, and they create inflammation throughout the body, which leads to the demise of the horse. Now, I don't know what causes laminitis. I have postulated a couple of things. One, the inflammatory cytokines can go down to the small capillary beds of the hooves, and it may cause inflammation. You could have glucose that is, for whatever reason, being converted over to fructose, just like it is in humans. There's no proof that I know of. Nobody's looked at this. But in humans, we've got an enzyme that will convert glucose into fructose under certain conditions. And fructose leads to the inflammation of the kidneys, causing increased blood pressure, and also the pancreas cells that create insulin. And it decreases insulin, which just doesn't help at all. But both of those are there to actually prepare us for the struggle through really tough times where there's absolutely no food. And it's temporary. So when food comes back in the spring, fructose kind of goes away, and we don't get fructose again until the fall, when the fruit now converts glucose into fructose. But the problem is, in humans anyway, we can convert glucose into fructose, especially if we're dehydrated when we take in glucose. It's just a weird thing. I've gone over this before. But there are so many factors going on with glucose metabolism in humans and in lab animals that we've got somewhat of a handle on, but nobody really knows what's happening to the horse. And that's where science is supposed to come in and save us. But of course, who's got the money to do this? Not too many. So they basically say fat. If your horse has a fat tailhead or crusty neck, you probably have insulin resistance. Now, I told you before that in humans, certain genetics will predispose us to get fat at certain places. It could be in your hips, it could be in your butt, it could be in your waist. And in certain conditions, it can go into the viscera, which is the abdominal cavity, and surround our organs. And that's the deadly kind. But we all know people who have very thin shoulders and chest and abdomen, and then at the waist on down, they just balloon out. That's genetics. But it still means that they're taking in more glucose than they need in a day. And I want to touch on that. Can we do a little sidebar here, folks? What is our adequate glucose intake? And this is fascinating. I was listening to one of our podcasts, I think it was number 49, a long time ago, when I talked about the electron transport chain. So don't get all, don't tune me out yet. It is basically a battery that sits inside every cell. And in that battery, they store all electric charges that are needed to run the equipment. So if your batteries are fully charged and your battery's in good condition, you'll be able to operate your phone, for example, or anything else that's battery derived or powered. But as the battery starts to wear down, it won't hold a charge as long. And it turns out that these electron transport chains will, over time, not be as efficient. And in fact, it's probably at the root of aging, where we just don't have the energy to do stuff like we did when we were young. As we're, 5 years old, we're running around everywhere and we just had all this energy. And then we fell asleep and we ate and we ran around again. Unfortunately, as humans get older, we sleep less, which is so important for recharging the batteries. We eat way too much inflammatory foods, which causes a higher output from the batteries to correct the inflammation. And between the two, as the horse gets older, it basically poops out. It just doesn't have the energy to be the athlete that it was when it was young. Same goes for us. And in human longevity and health span work, everyone is trying to get the batteries reconditioned. And as the batteries become reconditioned, they will operate better. And they do this by, number one, exercise. Number two, eliminating all processed foods and eating whole natural foods. And three, reducing glucose intake on a cyclical basis, which is a little bit interesting because we humans can eat just all meat for a long time, and then we crave that ice cream, and then we break down and get the ice cream. Well, it turns out that if you have a couple of days where you eat no sugar, and then a couple of days where you eat a little bit of sugar, lots of vegetables, and then one day you wolf down some ice cream with sugar in it, that actually is sending signals to the furnace in our cells called the mitochondria to switch back and forth. And when we go to a no sugar intake, we make sure that we take in some fat because that forces our mitochondria to use the fat for fuel. And we're flexing it. And it's called mitochondrial flexibility. In horses, it's a little bit different. And in horses, I've been suggesting that you give the horse some time off from eating. This making sure they have hay in front of them 24/7, I don't think is helping them. I think it's making things worse. I think horses out in the wild will spend a lot of time migrating, and they'll actually walk for hours before they stop and they have a little bit of food. And this on and off switch is important for them. I think giving horses their last meal, let's say 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night, and then nothing more until the morning, if they're being fed right and they have enough protein in their systems, they don't seem too upset about it. And they lose some body fat and they stay in pretty good condition, especially if you have the protein in there. So in other words, whether you're a horse or a human or a dog or any other animal, the first thing you should be thinking about is making sure you have enough protein in there. That helps solve so many problems. And then you're going to have access to pasture or to hay, which is last summer's pasture, or to time off where there's nothing coming into the horse's mouth. So their muscles can signal that there's a time to come in and start cleaning up through hormesis and start cleaning up all the dead and garbage, all the bad cells, clean them up through autophagy or apoptosis. Big words, I know, but it's basically cleaning up the cells. Then they can eat again. And if the sugar content is minimal, then they're not going to gain as much body fat, but you're not trying to eliminate sugar. In fact, eliminating sugar, bringing it to zero is almost impossible, because if you put no sugar, let's say you go on a fast for 24, 48 hours, even 72 hours, your body will be converting your amino acids into sugar to keep your brain going. It'll also be breaking down fats into ketones, and that also fuels the brain. So sugar always has to be there. It's not that evil. It's the excess sugar. That's the point I'm trying to get across. I think that's what they're trying to say in this article. Here it says, it's also probably not an accident that when EMS, equine metabolic syndrome, affected animals lose weight, some of the very last adipose tissues to be mobilized is in those high-risk deposits. Again, the crescent neck and the tailhead. I'll agree with that. And what happens is, as your horse starts to lose weight, and I'll put that in air quotes, lose weight, what's happening is you're now exposing the fact that most of the muscle underlying that fat and skin has been leaving the building a long time ago. And when you see the ribs, you're seeing the ribs, no doubt, but what you're really seeing is the lack of muscle between the ribs. And that big dip in between each rib is just muscle that's gone. And of course, you have the top line that looks bad. So you just have to be really, really patient. As your horse loses the body fat, as you alter their food intake, the lack of muscle is going to be exposed, and that takes a long time to come back. 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, somewhere in there, it'll come back. Here's interesting. It said in a recent study, a Nigerian research group examined the occurrence of equine metabolic syndrome in two separate populations of horses. One group of polo ponies residing in Igabi, there are 60 horses there, and a second group of companion horses owned by Emirates in Zaria, 56 horses. In total, 67.8% of the companion horses were diagnosed with EMS, and prevalence of EMS in obese horses was 92.86%. Obese horses were more than 10 times more likely to have EMS than underconditioned. A body condition score of less than 4.5 on the 9-point scale. And horses with a crescent neck were 9 times more likely to have EMS than horses with normal neck crests. So I think that's really interesting. It's not really a complete paragraph because they didn't really talk about the polo ponies. They basically said the companion horses, which they were insinuating are not exercising, whereas the polo ponies are exercising. Exercising helps build up the batteries, and it gives a place for the batteries to be discharged and then recharged. And so the whole metabolic system, which includes glycolysis and the Krebs cycle and the development of ketones and the storage of electrons in this electron transport chain, all happening inside every cell of the horse's body, is allowed to occur at peak efficiency. But when we all become sedentary, the body just follows. Hey, you're sedentary. We're just going to tone everything down a little bit. But our minds are saying, yeah, but don't I usually eat now? And then we start to take in more, and the batteries are starting to die out. So your brain is saying, hey, eat more. The batteries need more charging. So you start eating more and you end up eating more sugar. And yes, the batteries are going to get charged, but there's going to be more body fat. And it's just a chronic cycle. And I've seen it in horses. I mean, obesity was there back in the 70s, but it's mostly ponies and just fat retired horses. And they're going to die anyway. They were 25, 30, 35 years old, and some of them just get really fat. And if they lasted that long without laminitis, they probably wouldn't get it, and they would die of something else. But we also have colic and other things that are secondary to inflammation. Then they talked about breeds resistant, in quotation marks, to insulin dysregulation. Well, we've touched on this already. The breeds include Shetland ponies, minis, donkeys. You've seen them with just horrific fat pads on their back and their crusty neck, and people keep feeding them because they think they're cute. But food does not equal love. You just have to say, that's not the case. But as they say, it's not a one-size-fits-all category. There are multiple phenotypes of EMS, including the lean type EMS horses, which is why diagnostic testing for insulin dysregulation is so important. I personally have had a horse that was so hard, such a hard keeper, and yet he suffered horrible laminitis, and he was just not a happy horse. I'll never forget him. And now that I know what I know, it was probably because we kept feeding him extra food. And in some horses, when you do that, the microbiome, which is the bacteria that live inside your gut from the mouth to the anus, start to shift, and you start getting different bacteria in there. And for most horses and most humans, that bacteria says, let's make more fat, everything's fine. But I think there's skinny fat people and there's skinny fat horses where there's fat is not being put on the body, but the inflammation is so high that it leads to inflammation in the lamina of the feet. And bingo, we have that. And if you do test for them, they will have high insulin and high glucose. I'll never forget the horse that was being fed 9 quarts, whatever that is weight-wise, of sweet feed, because the horse is going into winter, and she just upped it because the horse is still skinny. And I tried to float the horse, and I couldn't. I mean, just touching the horse, and the horse became unglued. Psychologically, it just couldn't be worked with. So I told her that this horse might die real soon if she doesn't change something. And she says, oh, yeah, okay, fine. And not 4 days later, that horse had a horrible colic, went to the veterinary clinic where they diagnosed hindgut ulcers in that horse, and they took all grain away. And that's when the lady said, wow, maybe Dr. Tucker was right. And they started to put the horse on an all-forage diet, and no grain at all, no treats, no carrots, no sugar cubes, no apples. And fortunately, the horse survived and did really great. But unfortunately, the woman didn't understand the process that well. And I was just in the beginning of this quest to get education out there. And she continued to feed a lot of hay and a lot of pasture 24/7. And the horse blew up like a blimp and finally died prematurely of other problems because the horse really never had a chance to heal. Yes, the horse stopped having inflammation from the high concentrate rations of grain, but the sugar was still in there in the hay and in the pasture, and she wasn't able to regulate that. She's just happy the horse is alive, and then it died early. And I feel really bad about that. It says equine athletes can be affected by insulin dysregulation, equine metabolic syndrome too. So they say part of this is because many equine athletes are in fact overweight. Couldn't have been said better. I mean, I keep telling people, if I put 2 people in front of you One is a very skinny guy, like Where's Waldo. If you don't know who Where's Waldo is, or Bazooka Joe, these are tall, skinny human cartoon characters that have no muscling at all. They're basically stick figures. And you put him in there in a bathing suit and put him next to Michael Phelps, who most of us know he's the most gold-winning medal Olympian swimmer ever. And he was in bathing suits all the time in front of the cameras. And his lean muscular mass was obvious he was an athlete. Now, the question is, what do you consider an athlete? Because a lot of people think an athlete looks good with their excess body fat on. And it's not true. In fact, there are so many people who come to me and say, look, I hear what you're saying, but I've got an athlete. He's an endurance rider. He's a 3-day eventer. He's a jumper. He's whatever, barrel racer. How can I know if the horse has energy to run the race or to do things? And I gently say to them, energy comes from fat and sugar. When you feed enough sugar, the glycogen storage will be ready to be used for the race. But you don't want to use all that glycogen just getting the horse to the race, where they're hyperexcitable. They're prancing, they're jumping up and down. They're just consuming all their glycogen. In addition, if they don't have the muscles they need to do the job, they're going to have less glycogen storage. So now the horse is running the race before the race starts. And yes, some of them can win, they're gifted, but a lot of them just die toward the end, or at the end, they're huffing and puffing and their recovery is very long and they break down prematurely. Whereas if the horse was using their metabolism correctly, so they could use their body fat and have that be trickling in all the time as they go to the starter's box, the starting gate, or, wherever a horse starts, and they're even in the trailer ride to the event, if they're calm because they're not inflamed and they're using their fat to create energy to that point. And when the starter pistol goes off and they're asked to engage, the horse is going to switch over. He's going to be using the body fat and he's going to be dipping into the glycogen, and the mitochondria can use both. And they're going to have all the energy they need to get to the end and then still have some energy left over, where they're not huffing and puffing. Their recovery times are so much better. We've seen this in endurance horses and 3-day eventers, where they're done with the cross-country work and they're like, okay, can I do that again? I mean, it's so obvious. So if you're overfeeding your horse and you think he's an athlete and you're feeding glucose in excess of his daily needs, he will also start to get his insulin too high, and he will start to have these metabolic syndrome problems. So yes, you can test for it. I think your veterinarian and you can work together to see how this goes. But look at your horse and be honest with yourself. Does your horse have a nice bloom all over it? Could be too fat. Athletes don't need to be carrying extra fat. So just as a little thought experiment, I want you to think about your farrier's anvil. Now that's that big chunk of steel that he bangs the horseshoes on with a hammer. Now I want you to lift up that farrier's anvil. Some of you are going to say you can't do it, but they weigh somewhere between 60 pounds, give or take, maybe 80 pounds. Some are bigger than some are smaller, but let's just say 75 pounds, just a simple number. I'm going to take that farrier's anvil and I'm going to carry it and gently lower it onto your foot. And it's going to just be there. Now, it hurts, but it doesn't hurt so much that you want to move your foot, because you trust me and you understand this is a thought experiment. You're not going to say no. You're going to allow the heavy object to rest on your foot. It's only 75 pounds. I mean, you've got your kids or grandkids that are 75 pounds and they would stand on your feet. No big deal. All right. Now I'm going to take that anvil and I'm going to lift it up in the air. And I'm going to bring it up to 3 feet or a meter, whichever unit you want to use. And I'm going to hold it over your foot and say, okay, ready? And I'm going to let go. And it's going to fall to earth. And your foot, I guarantee, is going to move. Because you know that force equals mass, which is the mass of the block of iron, times acceleration, which is gravity bringing it down. Now, when gravity is met by the earth, and the earth pushes back with the same force, that force collides on the bones of your foot. So if there's no gravity coming down, then what you feel on your foot is just the mass of the anvil. But when it's dropped from a height, now we're adding acceleration that, bam, smashes that anvil up against your foot, and you have broken bones, right? That's 75 pounds. And yet I can't tell you how many people have said, oh, my horse needs another couple 100 pounds on him. And they start to feed him so the horse is fat. Well, if you put 100 or 200 extra pounds on there, that has to come down on the one front foot as it comes off the jump. Or as it's galloping, that has to be distributed not just on the hoof, but on the acceleration or the velocity of the horse as he's moving fast over the field. And every time he does, that foot goes bang with not just gravity, but the velocity of the horse going forward. So when you add excess acceleration and velocity to the mass, the force is going to be that much more than the horse just standing there. So the horse is standing in front of you and you say, wow, the horse, you know, hey, it looks pretty good. Well, it doesn't look like an athlete. Let's pretend we could take a knife and just scrape off all the fat to see what's actually underneath it. We could unzip the skin and the fat comes off with it. And then we look at the bones and the muscle that's there, and you'd be shocked. Most athletes don't have the muscle. This is why when you go to the racetrack and you see those young horses, they're 2.5, 3.5, 4 years old. They are muscled. You can see ribs. But it's obvious you're athletes. And these guys do great. Now, they're being fed a lot, but they're also being worked a lot harder than your horse, most likely. And your horse is now 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 years old, and they spend most of the time in the stall, or maybe they're turned out a little bit, but your work is about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. And yes, they're getting some good exercise, but then you end up feeding them excess glucose in addition to the hay, in addition to the pasture, 24/7, and the horse never has a chance to stop and say, okay, I've got some fat stores over here I need to get rid of. So you're feeding sugar in excess. And even though you're working the horse 45 minutes an hour, you're running barrels or you're doing something else, they're older and their batteries don't work as well as the 2 to 3 year old who's running a thoroughbred race. So now that's going into body fat. And that's leading the horse toward equine metabolic syndrome. So it's common for horses that are 10, 12 years of age to have broken down suspensories, tendons, hoof problems, laminitis, and be diagnosed with equine metabolic syndrome. I can't tell you how many, 10 to 14-year-old horses I go that are quote unquote athletes in the show circuit, and they already have a crusty neck and they have excess fat at their shoulders. And the owner thinks that these horses are athletes, and they're not. So I think this whole section on equine athletes can be affected by ID-EMS2 is phenomenal. I mean, it is absolutely important. And they go back to the Nigerian study here. It says they reported 67% of the leisure horses rarely exercised had EMS. However, 20% of the polo ponies that were exercised were still diagnosed with EMS. Exercise helps. Exercise helps to move the electron transport chain to increase their NAD to be converted into NAD+, which is giving up an electron to be stored in the battery. That's been well documented in humans. But if your horse is still getting fed more sugar than it needs, there's more inflammatory processes going on. So all that extra electrons that are being stored are being used to combat the inflammation at the gut lining, or the bug hypersensitivity, or the poor ventilation you've got, or just digesting the processed foods that you're feeding this horse, or the supplements that claim to be helping your horse, but in reality are causing more and more inflammation. The key to exercising a horse properly is to eliminate all potential inflammatory foods, so the gut now is running at 100% efficiency. And once it's running at 100% efficiency, and you give the time off that the horse needs to clean up the debris, then the horse can go into the event with more reserves than you could possibly imagine. It goes on. Horses with concurrent PPID or Cushing's disease, they say you should test. They say about 30 to 40% of horses with PPID also have insulin dysregulation, but it doesn't necessarily need to be considered in all horses with insulin dysregulation. So I've said this a million times. There are professors who have come and given talks who also agree that PPID, aka all these acronyms, Cushing's disease, is a neurodegenerative disease. My idea is that all neurodegenerative diseases are rooted in a horse who's not consuming enough protein or amino acids. And the dopamine, in this case, that's supposed to be going from the hypothalamus to pituitary, isn't doing its job. It's either not being made or something's happening. And the medication that they give replaces that dopamine, which helps horses with PPID resolve their issues. What I'm saying is we have to go one step back to what's causing this neurodegenerative disease. And I've given you plenty of evidence that I believe that it's increased sugar content, which causes the horse to start consuming its protein, also known as the amino acids. And over time, these horses can no longer generate what they need to make the pituitary work properly. And so it does have a dysregulation. And the dysregulation is it's not getting the signal to slow down. So it becomes enlarged. So yes, I agree that you want to look at PPID, but according to the professors, they say most PPID horses have lost muscle. And that just plays into what I'm saying. Why have they lost muscle? It's because they're not being fed enough protein, and whatever proteins they have are being consumed in the process called gluconeogenesis that turns the protein into glucose to keep the brain going, because they're being fed too much sugar and insulin is sequestering it, meaning it's taking it and hiding it in the fat stores. And in these thin horses, they're having trouble. It's like the skinny fat horses. They're having trouble maintaining their body weight, and they start to look horrible. The hair coat looks bad. The pot belly occurs. The back top line is gone, which are all signs of chronic protein deficiency, in addition to the horse not being able to put body fat on. So let's see what else they say. They should look at the non-structural carbohydrate of the hay. You should test your hay for the non-structural carbohydrate, and that's also called NSC, and that basically means the free sugars and the starch. In other words, anything that's in the plant that's not used to create the shape and the height of the plant, which is called cellulose. And if you've heard me before, horses will digest cellulose in their hindgut via their gut bacteria into short-chain fatty acids, and it's a high-fat diet. So let's just be looking at what cellulose is. It's a great source of fat for the horse. Non-structural carbohydrates, i.e. free sugars, glucose, and stored glucose in the form of starch, and fructose in the form of fructans in your spring grasses, will all lead to increased glucose and fructose, which will lead to increased body fat, which causes neurodegeneration, chronic protein loss, and the cycle goes on. Okay, it says it should be less than 12% non-structural carbohydrate hay. I think most of us will say you can soak the hay and soaking the hay really helps. So let's look at the take-home message. Adiposity is a key clinical feature of equine metabolic syndrome. Given a preponderance of ponies and horses are overweight, veterinarians and horse owners should consider EMS in many of those animals, particularly if they are at-risk breeds. Still, do not discount EMS in breeds at lower risk, athletic horses, and even other apparently healthy horses. We should now be actively looking outside of the fluffy pony paradigm for equids at risk for EMS. It can truly affect any of them. So, again, National Magazine decides to tackle this equine metabolic syndrome, and one of the biggest things they do is they eliminate all advertisements for grain. I'm thrilled. Kudos to the horse for stepping up and becoming a horse's advocate. I'm just so thrilled that you did that. Maybe you're listening to me. Maybe you're listening to others. Maybe you at the horse have too many horses yourselves that have had laminitis, and you're saying this has got to stop. But it has in this issue. And if we continue to say to these grain companies, stop killing our horses. If you want to supply oats or corn, and we use those judiciously to horses that are plowing our fields or for running races or that need that extra boost. I mean, if you've got an endurance horse and you want to get just a little bit more before you go, fine. Have some cleaned oats, take the hulls off. We've done that for years. The horse will use that extra energy, fill up its coffers, and be prepared to go, and it's going to run the race. It still will be able to flex back into fat metabolism at the end of the race. So you use it judiciously, but to give sugar to your sedentary horse that's just out in the pasture doing nothing, you're just killing him. And I think the message is finally getting through. So thanks. Thanks to all of you who listen to this, all of you who've never written a comment, who maybe have preconceived ideas of what we're trying to say here. Maybe you're realizing that we need to help horses thrive in a human world. And I'm going to tell you, if the Horse and Equus and other magazines stop advertising, and the American Association of Equine Practitioners separates themselves from these grain companies, if they start to realize that equine metabolic syndrome is killing our horses, then maybe I'll stop podcasting. Maybe I'll retire at that point. This is a good step. This is a good start. I'm so grateful that you're here tuned in, listening to this. Please pass it on. Please, if you like this, if you like what I'm saying, send the links to everybody. As many people as you know, put it in your group discussions. Say, what do you guys think about this? Hash it out. But I just read to you an article from the Horse magazine. I added my 2 cents. That's all I did. And I think the message is finally getting there. Thank goodness. All right. That's it, Doc T. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's 2 reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.